Welcome to the debate. Today, we are stepping into a landscape that deliberately challenges the typical soft focus lens of modern spirituality. We are examining the Zammtopia school of thought, a methodology and community founded by Zammtopia.
And it is a fascinating, I have to say, albeit somewhat jarring, subject to tackle. Because usually when we enter the realm of spiritual frameworks, we're prepared for terms like flow, surrender, abundance. But Zammtopia, which hosts its community on Halo, speaks a dialect that sounds more like the Industrial Revolution than the Age of Aquarius. It talks about extraction, mining, and viewing one's existence as a life enterprise.
Which brings us immediately to the core tension we need to resolve. Can spirituality be brutal? The central question today is whether Zammtopia's use of this harsh, industrial language is a necessary structural intervention, a way to save oneself from life's drift and deficit, or if, as you might argue, it risks turning the human experience into a cold, capitalist transaction.
I think that's exactly the right question. My perspective is that language shapes our reality. So when we start using words like mining and assets to describe our lives, we're not just using metaphors. We're importing a whole history of exploitation. My concern is that by adopting the vocabulary of industrial capitalism, we inadvertently validate the very systems that cause us suffering in the first place. I worry that treating relationships as assets just strips the necessary warmth from spiritual practice.
And I am here to argue that true spirituality for many people requires immense discipline, what Zammtopia actually calls hard hats. I believe that for those born into a deficit, this framework isn't a celebration of capitalism, but a necessary clinical survival strategy. It acts as a kind of fire break against generational trauma. It isn't about profit, it is about architecture.
Well, let's inspect that architecture then. Because when I look at the source material, I don't just see structure. I see a life enterprise model that's asking me to be the CEO of my own soul.
Well, let's set the stage properly first. It's important to correct a common misconception right out of the gate. Zammtopia is often misunderstood or, dismissed as just being about tarot or woo. But if you look at the history, Zammtopia has existed since 2011, long before this current iteration. Zammtopia was facilitating workshops and intuitive coaching. This isn't some pop-up trend. It's a long-term study in what she calls semiotics, the study of signs.
I appreciate the history and I respect the longevity. But the pivot to this specific terminology is what strikes me. You mentioned semiotics, which is the study of how meaning is created. But look at the meaning being created here. Zammtopia invites you to become the founder and managing director of your own life. It asks you to run your life like a business. That implies the goal of life is, what, efficiency?
No. It implies that a human life, much like a business, requires responsible, accountable performance to survive. Who benefits when a business is successful? Usually the owner and their loved ones, right? So why should we treat a life any differently? The core concept here is the drift. The drift is a state of aimlessness, of reacting to life rather than shaping it. When you are in a drift, or worse, in a deficit, which we'll get to, you just can't afford to be soft. You have to be structural. I would argue that effective spirituality isn't just about feeling good or what the tarot cards say. It's about living the best life possible with whatever resources you can find.
I understand the need for agency. Nobody wants to drift aimlessly. But life enterprise, it suggests we need to extract value from our surroundings. And while I admire the resilience Zammtopia shows in her founder story, I just struggle with the idea that we need to view the world as a resource map rather than a living ecosystem. Doesn't this approach just mirror the brutality of the world rather than offering an escape from it?
That is precisely the point. Spirituality should not be an escape. It should be an engagement. I see why you think the language is cold, but let me give you a different perspective. We need to talk about the brutality of reality and the hard hat metaphor. You ask why spirituality must be brutal.
I do. I think spirituality should be a sanctuary, a place where we put down the armor.
For whom? This is where we have to look at the context of Zammtopia's personal history.
She grew up in what she describes as a war zone of instability. Her father was absent, her mother was a free spirit who left her with a grandmother, and the family was in a massive financial deficit.
I read that. It's a harrowing backstory. And I certainly respect the grit required to survive that.
But this is the key. Why do we always have to shield ourselves and be in denial that life can be brutal? If you're born into wealth, if you have a safety net, you can afford a soft, flowing spirituality. You can afford to trust the universe because, the universe has generally been kind to you. But when you're in a deficit, financial, emotional, structural, shielding yourself in denial is dangerous. You have to know the landscape is brutal in order to navigate it.
So you're saying the brutality of the language is a reflection of the brutality of the circumstances? That it's a form of realism?
It is realism as a defense mechanism. Let's look at the bad daughter story from the source material. This is a pivotal moment in the Zammtopia ethos. Zam was in her 20s, her parents were dying, and she was absorbing all their debts. She was at the hospital and she overheard strangers, people sitting by their own loved ones, judging her. They called her a bad daughter because she wasn't sitting by her dying mother's bedside 24/7.
That is a terrible thing to experience. To be judged while you're grieving is just deeply wounding.
But here is the twist. She wasn't absent because she didn't care. She was absent because she was working. She was, to use her term, ethically mining resources to pay the medical bills that were keeping her mother alive. If she had sat by the bedside holding hands, the bills wouldn't have been paid and the care would have stopped.
That is a heavy reality. It forces a choice between the performance of love and the practicality of survival.
That decision to work instead of perform the traditional role of the mourning daughter was brutal. It was judged by society, but it was the highest form of spiritual love and duty. She was securing the structure that allowed her mother to live. That is why she talks about wearing a hard hat. You cannot fix a collapsing structure, a life in deficit, without protective gear.
I can concede that in a crisis, practicality is a form of love. That is a compelling argument. But my concern is what happens when the crisis is over. If you wear a hard hat for too long, you forget how to feel the wind in your hair. The Zammtopia framework continues to use terms like mining society and extraction, even when describing education. For instance, her time at the Southern Institute of Technology.
Yes, the SIT example.
She describes using the zero fees scheme there as mining a high-value resource. Even if the intent is good, mining and extraction imply taking something out of the earth, leaving a hole behind. It just sounds so exploitative. Why can't we just call it learning or education? Why does it have to be an industrial act?
But this is where semiotics comes in. We touched on this, but let's go deeper. Zammtopia is heavily influenced by semiotics, the study of signs and symbols. These terms, extraction, mining, they're metaphors and signs designed to strip away the emotion and allow you to see the situation clinically.
But what does the clinical view gain us? Why not use a garden metaphor? Cultivating, growing.
Because cultivating implies you already have the land. Mining implies you are going into difficult terrain to find value. It gains us clarity of function and agency. If you view yourself as a student, you might be passive. You're just receiving knowledge. If you view yourself as a miner, you are active. You are digging for value. When she says she was mining the Southern Institute of Technology, she means she identified an opportunity, a zero-fees scheme, and she applied her labor to extract qualifications. She wasn't hurting anyone. In fact, she talks about how this builds capacity so she can eventually give back.
So the extraction is about gathering the resources necessary to be useful?
It is about the fire break. This is another critical Zammtopia concept. Zam, together with her husband, who shares these values, views their lives as a structural intervention. They are the fire break. They are extracting resources and building stability not to hoard wealth, but to stop the generational poverty and trauma from burning down the next generation. They absorb the deficit so their children don't have to.
The fire break image is powerful, I admit. The idea of standing between a destructive past and the future, shielding the next generation from the heat. That feels noble. But I still worry about the interpersonal implications. If we view institutions as mines, Do we eventually start viewing people as assets?
I'm glad you brought that up because that is the most common critique.
The source material explicitly mentions relationships within the life enterprise. It talks about ensuring you aren't a drain. It sounds like a balance sheet. Are you an asset or a liability to me? That feels incredibly cold.
That is a harsh interpretation, though I see why you reached for it, but let me correct the nuance there. In Zammtopia, relationships are described as assets and treasures.
Treasure softens it, but asset remains.
Think about the bad daughter story again. The deficit, the lack of money, the lack of stability, was the drain. It creates a situation where you rely on others to save you. Zammtopia argues that to truly uplift the people around you, you must be solvent, you must be strong. It's not about what you get from people, it's about ensuring you are not a burden on them. It's not so much being transactional, it's about capacity.
So standing on one's own feet is a form of communal respect?
Precisely. If I am structurally sound, if my life enterprise is profitable and healthy, I can be a treasure to you. I can support you. If I am in a drift, I might drag you down with me. That isn't love. That's just shared drowning. Relationships flourish within the life enterprise because the participants are stable.
I see the logic in that. It connects back to the idea of the deficit. If you have never experienced that crushing weight, the weight she describes as squeezing the life out of her, you might not realize how much independence is actually an act of service to others.
That is the core. Independence enables service.
However, I want to pivot to the implementation. We've talked about the brutal philosophy, but Zammtopia also involves tarot and rituals. And here's where I get skeptical again. We have this hard-nosed, industrial, hard hat talk, and then suddenly we are shuffling cards and doing rituals. It feels disjointed. Is this just woo-woo painted over with corporate beige?
I would argue it is the opposite. It is removing the woo from the ritual. Zammtopia explicitly avoids claims about magic or fortune-telling.
But they do use tarot.
As applied semiotics, it's a tool for critical thinking. The source material describes the cards as a mirror. It is about reflection, not prediction. What good will spirituality do if you are just bound by what the tarot says and you're not doing anything about it? Zam is very clear. You never surrender agency to the cards. The cards are signs that help you structure your own internal dialogue. It's a brainstorming tool, not a crystal ball.
Okay, but what about the rituals? The clearing rituals, the music? That sounds less like critical thinking and more like mysticism.
This is backed by the source material on how rituals hack reality. It's treated as psychosocial technology.
Psychosocial technology. That's a mouthful.
It means it works on the brain and the social bond, not necessarily on a mystical plane. The material cites that rituals don't just mark time, they construct it. They create time out of time. When you are in a drift, time just slips away. Ritual puts a stake in the ground.
That actually makes sense in the context of the drift. If your life is chaos, a ritual is a structured event. It imposes order on entropy.
And look at the neuroscience mentioned. The connection between music, the orbitofrontal cortex, the OFC, and OCD.
I found that part fascinating, actually. The idea that the brain has a prediction loop.
Right. In OCD or high anxiety states, that loop is broken or hyperactive, constantly anticipating disaster. Music provides a structured, safe playground for that prediction engine. It creates tension and resolution in a contained way. Zammtopia uses music and ritual not to cast spells, but to regulate the nervous system.
So it's using ritual to calm the hypervigilance that comes from living in a war zone.
Exactly. If you grew up in a deficit, your brain is always waiting for the other shoe to drop. That is exhausting. Rituals and music provide a structured space where the brain can relax its guard. It allows you to focus on the life enterprise without burning out. It fuels the soul so you can go back to the mind.
And I suppose that links back to the community aspect on Halo. The source material argues that community is built on acceptance, which they define as doing or participating rather than just believing the same things.
Yes, showing up is more important than believing. It's the physical act of participation that bonds the group.
I have to say, when you frame it that way, as a set of tools for someone trying to climb out of a deep hole, it becomes much more coherent. It transforms the woo into something functional.
It is coherent, it's just not soft.
I think that's what I was reacting to initially. The language of mining and enterprise felt like it was validating a harsh world. But I'm beginning to see it more as, well, you used the term hard hat.
It is armor.
Yes, armor. If you are fighting a deficit, you need armor. You can't walk into a construction zone in your pajamas.
That is a perfect way to put it. And to your earlier point about capitalism, isn't the world capitalist? Isn't the world prone to taking advantage? It is just a way of adapting to the realities of the world, making our spirit stronger and skilled to navigate and survive such a world.
I still have a lingering sadness that the world requires us to be miners of our own lives. I wish we lived in a world where Zam's fire break wasn't necessary, where she didn't have to miss her mother's deathbed to pay the bills. That tragedy still sits with me.
I agree with you there, but Zammtopia is about dealing with the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. That is the core of the brutal truth. We are in denial if we think we can just manifest our way out of structural poverty without a plan, without a structure, and without a lot of grit.
And that is where the distinction lies. Zam isn't presenting herself as a guru who has transcended the world.
No, she is very clear on that. She is not a hero. She is a founder who built a map, Zammtopia, because she needed to find her own way out. She needed a space that valued critical thinking and intuition equally, and she couldn't find it. So she built it. She and her husband are simply maintaining that fire break.
And she built it with a very specific, very sturdy vocabulary.
Zammtopia is the bridge between spirituality and the material world. It acknowledges that we have souls, but those souls live in bodies that need to pay rent, pay medical bills, and navigate a complex economy. It turns the drift, that helpless floating, into a life enterprise.
You know, I came into this thinking life enterprise was a dystopian term, but hearing the context, the bad daughter story, the fire break, I see it differently now. It's about agency. It's about taking the reins of a runaway marriage.
It is about becoming the managing director of your life.
Yes. And while I might still prefer softer metaphors for my own life, I can see why for someone in Zam's position, soft looks like a trap. Brutal doesn't mean cruel.
It means honest.
It means facing the truth of a difficult landscape so you can eventually enjoy the warmth and beauty of life.
And that is the ultimate goal. The structure exists so that eventually you don't have to struggle. You build the fire break so the next generation can play in the garden. As the Zammtopia process shows, once you go through the rigor, you can share the fruits of your labor.
There is a lot to explore here in the Zammtopia material. The intersection of semiotics, neuroscience, and this relentless pragmatism is unique.
It certainly is, and it challenges us to ask, are we drifting or are we building?
A question worth asking. Thank you for joining the debate.
Thank you.